So if you could, very good, thank you. So if you could all please mute yourselves so we can avoid any background noises, that would be wonderful. And we will definitely make sure to make this session available to all CBA members and those who attended tonight. So in today's webinar, exploring our financial obligations, we will take a deeper dive actually into what's involved in both the short-term and long-term categories of strategic financial planning. In part 3, our next session in November, the final installment on November 16th, entitled Investments for Growing Endowment, Perpetual Care, and Other CBG Funds. We will address some of the ways that conservation burial grounds are implementing their plans in order to fulfill their perpetual obligations, not only to the people that they serve, but also to the conservation of the land that they manage. So just a couple of introductions and housekeeping items. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Amy Henriksen, and I am the steward for Kokosing Nature Preserve here in Gambier, Ohio. I am one of the founding members of the Conservation Burial Alliance, and I will be your moderator for tonight's session. You will be hearing from 3 other founding members of the Conservation Burial Alliance during this webinar this evening. And those folks are Laura Starkey, who is the founder and executive director of Heartwood Preserve in Trinity, Florida. Jeff Maston is a co-founder of Land Matters, which is a conservation consulting firm, and also Blue Stem Conservation Cemetery, which recently opened in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. And then Freddie Johnson is one of the founders of Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery in Gainesville, Florida. I also mentioned Robert Dudney. Is Robert on, Laura?
No, he is not.
Okay. Robert is an accountant and volunteer at Larkspur in Nashville, Tennessee, and he has also played a key role in helping develop this webinar this evening. Few other housekeeping items before we get started. We do want to note that in these webinars, just like last webinar and as will be the case in November, we are sharing our collective experience as practitioners of conservation burial. So you definitely need to keep in mind that suggestions we make here should be weighed as to their relevance in your particular conservation burial project, in your particular state, especially important to keep in mind. As you follow along, please type any questions or comments in the chat. I will be turning this over soon here to Laura, and so I will be watching throughout the presentation. Throughout the webinar, I'll be watching for your questions in the chat. Our presentation will be probably no more than an hour, and we will allow about a half an hour at the end for question and answers. So please do enter those questions in the chat, and I will be collating those for the end. As I noted earlier, the webinar is being recorded. We'll send a link to the recordings to all attendees and CBA members, hopefully within a week of tonight's webinar. So we have an excellent set of speakers who are pioneers in this field, and we have a lot we can learn from them. So in tonight's session, we will continue the journey to creating, operating, and maintaining a conservation burial ground. If you were able to join us for our first webinar on exploring financial obligations for conservation burial grounds, you'll recall that we focused on the financial organization, development, and management of conservation burial grounds. We covered what is applicable not only to startup organizations, but to existing organizations as well. We addressed standards, guidelines that relate to financial management and sustainability. If you weren't able to join us, the video of that first segment was recorded also, and it can be viewed by CBA members and those who paid for that webinar. Same will be true for all this and all of our webinars. In this evening's session, part 2, exploring financial obligations, we'll take a deeper dive, as I said, into the items that were introduced and discussed in part 1. And I will now hand the presentation over to Laura Starkey, who will begin.
Hi, everybody. Really glad everyone's here. We're getting a really nice turnout. That's great. So we're going to divide up the categories of financial obligations into short-term and long-term planning. Now, I realize a lot of our audience, you all are made up of folks from a range of places along the process. From some of you are maybe still in the vision planning stage. Some of you may be up and running already, and any places in between. So for the short term, we're going to talk about gathering your startup funds, moving into your early operations, and reaching the point of break even. So regardless of whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit structure, you still want to be able to not lose money in the long haul. I'm going to talk about market research, and then we will go into building a budget, and then we'll delve into endowing the future through land trusts. So for long-term planning, that can be anywhere from 5 years to 50 to 100 years or more. You'll be thinking about your big vision. What do you really want to see happen in the big grand scheme of things with your project? And what happens after the cemetery is full? The endowments that you're beginning now in the short term are really going to secure your ability to reach those goals in the vision in the long run. So who are you? The market research. This might seem like an odd item for a discussion on financial planning, but it's really important to do some research and analysis on your market for a number of reasons. It's important for fundraising if you're a nonprofit, bringing in investors, partners, writing grants, convincing your cemetery licensing board to accept you for your license, and developing a realistic startup budget. So it's an important part of any business plan, and a conservation burial ground should be no different. You can find templates out there for your business plan to use if you don't already have one, and those should all include a market analysis and a marketing plan. So just find a template that works for you. I found a few good ones through SCORE, that nonprofit that helps small businesses, SCORE.org. They just have a lot of good resources for small operations, and a lot of it will apply to a nonprofit as well. So do your homework to find out who you're serving. What's your community? What you should have a sense of who your community is, just kind of innately if you've lived in that area for a long time. But you kind of want to really hone in on, just from a more, quantitative, possibly sort of perspective. So, because you want to figure out what you could reasonably expect from your community in terms of supporting this. You want to consider your area's market in terms of population. Is it rural? Is it the suburbs? Are you close to an urban area? Are you 4 or 5 hours from an urban area? What are the cultural groups in the area that might really support this? Is there an immigrant community, or a African-American community, or an Anglo-American community? Is there an immigrant, just whatever that is? There are a lot of different cultural groups that could really, get excited about what you're doing. Think of your market in terms of religion, age, socioeconomic levels, lifestyle. Are your people in your part of the world, are they outdoorsy types? Are they retirees? Are they military? Are they wealthy? Are they not so wealthy? They're all just to get a picture. You want to look at the death rate for your area. What is your demographic population in terms of age and gender? Are you a bunch of boomers? Are you a bunch of older than boomers? Or do you have more Gen X? All of that kind of stuff. To find out the death rate for your region, I invite you to take a trip down the rabbit hole of the U.S. Census. If you haven't been on the U.S. Census website or similar ones, there's 2 good web sources for all the statistics you could possibly hope to look at. There's I found usafacts.org and usa.gov. Those are based on the U.S. Census and other, I'm not sure where all their sources are. And of course, the U.S. Census itself, their site is census.gov. So just be prepared to just spend some time in it. It's kind of fun to get in there and be like, wow, I never knew these details of our markets. That anyway, it's a rabbit hole. I'll just suffice to say it's a rabbit hole if you're like me anyway. So basically, once you get this death rate, these statistics, you're going to look at the national level of what the big picture is of the at the national level, and then you want to kind of hone in on your regional or your local level. For the national level, of course, there's the census that I mentioned, but you can also CANA, which is the Council on, wait a minute, Cremation, what is it? You guys know this. Cremation Association of North America. AARP had a funeral and burial planners survey in 2007 that I used. It's pretty old, but that was helpful for me back years ago. I couldn't find anything more recent, but maybe they've done a more recent survey. The US Census again. Amy shared with us this website with emergenresearch.com, an industry report on green funerals market. So that's a good source if you need that. These are all just kind of giving you data to just kind of defend yourself and when you're presenting your case to, raise money or to support this this project. On the local and regional level, in addition to the census, you might have a regional planning council, chambers of commerce. A lot of them will have information on your specific region. You can also use a DIY natural burial interest survey, meaning do it yourself, create your own survey. I just used SurveyMonkey. If you're familiar with that website, you can go on and you can pay for a membership for the length of time that you need it, for a month or something. You can create your own survey. And what I did was send it out. I created a survey on people's interest in natural burial versus conventional, and just asked a few just sort of general questions to get a pulse of what people would be interested in. Again, you're just defending your case of why this is a worthwhile project to people who need to be convinced. We don't need to be convinced, but the outer world of funders and investors or whoever will need some solid reason to believe. So what I did with my survey was I sent it to the non-obvious people in my mailing list, the people that weren't necessarily my environmental buddies who I knew were going to say the right answer. I didn't want to be filled up and skewed towards that group. So I sent it to my less environmentally, obvious people. And then I asked them to send it to their contacts. So I tried to just really spread it out to a broad audience. And then you can actually purchase respondents through SurveyMonkey. You just pick out your demographics. Say, I want people from ages 40 to 55, and then from 55 to 70, and then they can divvy it up, and you can pick which different demographic groups. So and then you pay like 50 cents a respondents or something. So you can actually get for not that much money, you can just get a nice little survey and and you can pick your state of Florida or something. So I recommend that. I found that to be very valuable information. So you're going to basically taking all of these statistics, you're going to calculate your data, you're going to extrapolate, you're going to analyze, you really just want to come to a reasonable understanding of your market. You also, like I mentioned earlier, you want to use your own innate knowledge of your community. If you've lived there all your life or a long time, you should have a good sense of your community. So talk about that in your business plan, but this is also stuff that will kind of back it up. Obviously in Florida, I live in an area which I could have told you, we got a lot of retirees. We've got a lot of across the political belief spectrum. It's Florida after all, and we're in a coastal suburban area. So a lot of it was kind of in the no duh category, but it was still interesting to hear it and to learn it on 65% of the population is that, or 35 or whatever. So, and then we're now going to turn into the world of budgets. So this is all going to Jeff. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeff at this point.
Thanks, Laura. I want to emphasize the importance of what Laura just talked about, because I having recently gone through the business planning process, the information provided great resource for being able to talk to our funders and our donors, and to give them confidence that there is a market, for example, in the region, and that it would be supported, and that their investment in your organization really has value and is justified. So I just want to emphasize that. So as I said, I just gone through the process in developing Bluestem Conservation Cemetery. And so I thought I'd kind of share some of what we've learned in the process. Starting a conservation burial ground is a capital intensive endeavor. And regardless of what your your land purchase or your other expenses, your theory of practice, it's nonetheless you need to make sure that you understand how much money you need and when you need it, so that you can fulfill all your obligations to launch yourself from theory and idea to implementation. There's a variety of ways of funding a project. You can borrow funds, you can get investors, you can help, you can fundraise, to name, kind of the more frequently used methods, but there are others, including grants and foundations. The method you choose is partially dependent on the type of organization you build and your philosophies and desired levels of risk. You need sufficient funds to acquire land, to build the cemetery, to fund the startup purchases of items and staffing, and ultimately to provide a sufficient cash flow for your operations for years 1 through 3 mainly, because that's really the time when you're building your project where you have a lot of you have challenges, unforeseen challenges. You have growth and build in construction and other elements that you will need to fund. And so focusing a lot of attention in years 1 through 3 and cash flow is quite important. Build a conservation burial ground is, as a conservation burial consultant at Land Matters, we've frequently heard stories and the desired outcomes for making just a conservation cemetery happen. Frequently, we hear oversimplified expectations about the cost and the simplicity of opening the cemetery. I'll tell you right now, it's nothing to take lightly. In dispelling the notion, if anything, I'd suggest that you remain kind of very conservative throughout your planning and implementation, so as not to paint yourself into a corner. There are real financial hurdles and significant administrative obligations without shortcuts for getting there. Remember, you're building a 50 to 150 year project that needs to be strong and durable beyond you. And so, was that?
Had a whole bunch
Oh,
of.
could you mute, please?
Farther back than you want, but.
Start with a realistic expectation of time and money. Takes longer to do everything than you expect. It often takes more money than you expect as well. Key obligations in building your financial picture is having the funds you need at the time that you need them. So that's actually quite important. And that's where cash flow is quite important. Many believe that they can pre-sell plots to raise the needed capital. I would strongly advise against this, and in many cases it might be illegal within your state to do this. It's really not, it's really a way that you can potentially set yourself up for failure. You'll not regret having the deliberate and conscientious approach to outreach to your community to raise the funds that you need, or to raise the funds through investment. The outreach is a good test of your model, and it helps build your pitch and your vision and your language that will endure and help be supportive of you as you launch your project. Funders and donors are very sophisticated, and they'll want to know what you have, that you have the answers to the questions about fiscal responsibility. So they're not just interested in the green burial side of your project. Many of them really want to know, if I invest in your project, what commitment do I have that you will actually be able to raise all the funds that you say that you need, and you'll be able to pull this off? Prove to me that you can do that. Commonly from funders and donors, we heard kind of some of the following. Who have you gotten your money from? I would consider giving you money once you have a fundraising track record. In other words, I don't want to be the first one through the door. How can I be assured that you will be successful? Building public trust, even long before you begin to raise funds, can be supportive of building your community. You're a valuable resource for getting the word out in your neighborhood and your region. If you borrow to fund your project, understand when you need to start paying it back, how you will fund it, and the impact of interest payments on your operations. Do not overestimate your sales potential or underestimate your expenses. You do that at your own peril. It's not impossible to have investors for a nonprofit, but it's more unusual, and it definitely can be challenging. Ensure that you have good legal and fiscal advice. You don't want to be on the wrong side of the IRS for your nonprofit status. Projects can definitely be phased, so that's one way of thinking about your project, is maybe it all doesn't have to happen at once, and that you can phase into it, and that can really change your financial picture. So you can get it up and running and grow your cemetery without some of the complications of having to build it all from the beginning. Next slide. So that was about the kind of the dollar, the money that you need for building your project, not just the kind of the items, but also the paying for the resources, paying for the technical expertise, and et cetera, which is quite important, because you do have to generally, in most states, go through a regulatory process of some kind. And many times you'll need to use professional resources to help fill out applications or to create your site plan or things like that. So it's quite important. So when you're building your project, perform the calculations that realistically represent your startup funding needs. Many of the important categories to consider for this calculation are listed in the part 1 of the series. So we've kind of talked about some of these things in part 1. Budgets, you're essentially developing budgets, and these budgets must demonstrate that funding is sufficient for the operations to continue until your cash flow from operations, your sales, your at-need burials, your pre-sales, your product sales, et cetera, will begin to provide ample funding to continue your operations. Project out sufficient operations to demonstrate startup, growth, and operations. Ensure that sales meeting future expenses, your sales meet your future expenses and expectations. Also ensure that you're realistic and that there are ample funds on hand to cover your staffing, because that can underestimating time and human resources is not a hard thing to do. Luckily, we've been given such tools out there as Excel and other programs that can allow you to develop kind of different budgets. I would strongly advise that you do not just develop your most optimistic budget, but you really develop different forms of budgets, and that are changeable, so that you can change your assumptions. Maybe you have different pricing models, or maybe you have different staffing models, or even sales expectations, and each one of those changes your entire model. And that's the beauty of using something like Excel. You can really kind of game out all of your different the financial impacts from different things. Next slide. So here's some examples of how we at Bluestem broke down kind of our expenses. We tried to kind of truncate them into kind of simple groups. Kind of, there's no real rules for doing this, but it's this information is really also the information that your board or your committee or your funders really need and would desire to ensure that you've actually really thought through all of the potential expenses that are there. So it really depends on what you anticipate for your land, to the condition or need of your improvements for restoration, your strategy for operations, burials, and land management. The more detailed you can make your budget with ample research, so very specific, the more confidence you can bring to the process. And maybe when you start, it doesn't have to be there, but you can build iterative budgets to actually get a much more refined picture. The kind of the iterative nature of the budgeting process allows this refinement and provides more confidence for you and for those that are using your budget to make decisions. And then consider the infrastructure. Do you need everything all at once? Can it be phased out? What you build, you have to really be able to take care of. So, really think about that. Do you really need that fancy building right away, or even at all, knowing that you have to take care of that at some point in the future? These are all just parts of your strategy that you figure out along the way. Kind of, if you have 5 miles of trails that you build, how are you going to take care of it? And you build that into your budget. And maybe it's not in year 1, but maybe in year 5 you open up the 5th mile. How are you going to take care of the stewardship? And this kind of leads to some of our future conversations about land or future management of your sites. Next slide. So a key part of the budgeting is the what ifs, these contingencies. You have to be adept at problem solving and planning for contingencies that you may never face, but you should be prepared to should they kind of materialize. How do you handle financial challenges, revenues that don't hit the mark, over larger expenses than you expected? Failure is not an option for you. Particularly once you start your first burial, you're on the track. You have to figure out how to make it work. So a key point is there are professionals out there that you can reach out to. You can utilize groups like SCORE. You can utilize local volunteers and other professionals that might give you some of their time to help you really make the most secure planning and problem solving system out there. But plan ahead, understand how your pricing fits within the market, local market, regional market, national market. Thus the importance of what Laura talked about earlier. Understand how your fundraising and the success of your fundraising will impact your budget and your ability to pull off your project. And just watch out for overestimating your revenues and underestimating your expenses. And next slide. So this is a tough slide to look at, I realize, but it's an example. This is an example of kind of our at Bluestem, our kind of pre-operations planning and implementation. It's kind of, we calculated and track, and it's just a simple project that we Excel project that we created that gives us the information we need to make our decisions. So our projections of expenses, our actual expenses, our cumulative expenses, our fundraising success, our available funds, all of these things are kind of fit within this document, and it just was the tool that worked for us to be able to do this. And this is the nice thing: there is no one particular way of doing it. As Laura said, there are great tools out there with SCORE and other organizational tools that you can use to really help you get to where you need to. And then, once you, ensure that you have the funds that you need also to be restricted. So for example, we at Bluestem are not even open yet, but we've actually had 3 burials already. And what that means is we've started to create some of our obligations. We've started to create our obligation for our endowment. Well, I'm even tracking that on this sheet here to ensure that those funds are not money that I have available. Those are funds that actually will go and fit into our endowment funds once those are up and running. So I wasn't expecting that, but that unanticipated thing happened, and we were prepared for it. Next slide. So this is also another example. This is an example of our cash flow budgeting. It demonstrates a simple mathematical flow of funds in and out. So you can build this as part of your 10-year projection, which I would advise you to look at a 10-year and really focus on clarity within the first 3 years. You can also create monthly cash flow projections, which will be quite important later on to ensure that you're able to hit payroll and some of your other expenses. Want to point out that your funds available must deduct funds that by law or by design get set aside for long-term maintenance. And that's one of the things that this cash flow document shows, is that we also have developed what we call opportunity funds that are set aside for our other organizational purposes, and we set those aside here. So it's revenue that we generate that is not necessarily available for covering all expenses, but go into funds to help with affordability, accessibility, conservation, or other value-driven purposes. So my experience as a kind of a consultant, and the reason many states mandate maintenance endowments, or sometimes also referred to as perpetual care funds, is that there's a tendency to overlook this and not set aside enough money early in the lifetime of an organization, leaving an organization unprepared for its lifetime when sales begin to slow. So this is kind of my segue into kind of Laura now speaking to this point, speaking about state mandated perpetual care funding. And this is kind of a critical attribute of one way that you can set yourself up for success down the line. Next slide to Laura.
Did we lose Laura? There you are.
Classic. Sorry. At our first webinar, we mentioned care and maintenance trust fund. We also call it the perpetual care or the endowment care fund. So I want to go into a little more detail on that now. Many states require cemeteries to have this trust fund, and they have a mandated amount to go into it for each burial space that's sold. 10% is probably the most common required amount that's required. Your burial ground may decide to put more in, or you might put a separate percentage for a separate fund. We'll talk about those options, or a flat amount into a similar fund like a land conservation fund or an opportunity fund. Freddie's going to touch on that in a little bit. While this is often mandated by the state, it's also good to remember that the reason for this isn't just because the state's got to make a requirement, but they're really doing that because of consumer protection. Their interest is to make sure that the consumer is not going to get taken for a ride after they die, that someone is going to leave the cemetery insolvent to where there's no funds to be able to maintain that cemetery, or that in the case of pre-need trusts, that the services that the cemetery promised that they took money for, that those funds will run out by the time the person actually dies and needs those services and goods. So it's really in there about consumer protection. So it's kind of helpful to keep that in mind. There are a lot of older cemeteries in Florida. We get a lot of stories in the news, especially lately in the Tampa Bay area, of older cemeteries that have been abandoned or been bowled over, or have no funds left to manage any type of care or maintenance. And so future families down the road And the communities or the townships or municipalities, they're kind of left holding the tab on the care of these older cemeteries. So the state's really, started this endowment care trust fund requirement just to try and prevent that from happening in the future. For us as conservation burial ground folks, we really need to consider it a best practice because it behooves us, it behooves the earth, the project that we're doing in our community to do that. Pre-need trust funds are basically based on any goods and services that you sell prior to death, what we would call pre-need. Some burial grounds, every state has a different requirement on who can sell pre-need. In Florida, it's either you have one type of, there's two different types of licenses in Florida. You're either licensed as an exempt cemetery, such as Prairie Creek, or a non-exempt cemetery, such as Heartwood Preserve. Exempt cemeteries are not able to sell pre-need. Non-exempt cemeteries are licensed to do that. So for those who are licensed to be able to sell pre-need, you're selling basically the burial space. You've got the 10% going into that trust fund, and then you've got separate fund for any merchandise and services that you sell. Merchandise meaning not t-shirts and ball caps. I always, when I first heard that, I thought merchandise, it sounds like t-shirts and ball caps. No, it's merchandise such as any grave markers. If you're selling engraved stones, or in our case, we have small metal plaques, but that's considered merchandise. So if you sell that ahead of time, or services, which would be your opening and closing fee, that is, everyone has an opening and closing service. So those are the ones that are pre-sold. You, let's see, where are my notes here? Let's go on. Yeah, self-mandated. Yeah, let me go on to the next slide, please. Right here, I have an excerpt from a standard cemetery contract, our contract that we use in Florida. And this gives an example of the type of the percentage amounts required. If in the yellow fund, yellow highlight, you'll see that's what's required is 10% of your funds collected, or $25, whichever is greater, for your interment rights. And in the pink, you'll see the required percentages for pre-need trust funds, 30% of your merchandise, for example, your markers or your gravestones, and 70% of your services, your opening and closing. And I should also point out that it's the greater of the 30% is the greater of the retail price of what you charged, or 110% of the wholesale cost, whichever is greater for your merchandise. So for example, we sell our burial plaque at, for example, $600. You look at the wholesale price, say that's $200. So 110% of that would be $220. So whichever is greater, 30% of 600, or, do the math. So that's how they basically set those. If you look at it, this is basically pointing to the fact that you need to calculate your individual costs and prices so that they're really being able to support in the long run as well as the short run what you're selling. So in the long run, for example, if 10% of your burial rights comes to less than $25, which means that would be less than $250 for a burial space, even the state is saying that's probably too little to build a fund on. So just a thought. That's how I interpret that. So go to the next slide, please. So I just put together a little example spelling out of how that would work through this example. I'm just setting just random pricing. This is not, recommended or not recommended. It's just an example of pricing. So if you do a purchase for a pre-need purchase with trusted amounts. So on the left column, these are what you're selling. At Heartwood, for example, we sell three things: a burial space, that's your interment rights, your burial right. Let's say, for example, it's $2,000. Go to the right, you've got the care and maintenance trust fund, 10%, that's going to be $200. Your opening and closing cost, if it's say $500, your services, 70% of that is $350. Memorial marker, if you sell it for $200, then the pre-need marker amount is $60 of that. So when you take out those trusted amounts, that's going to be $610 that's going to come out of your the $2,700 check that you got from the customer, from your client, your family. So of that, your operating revenue that's going to go into your operating, you're going to just figure 2,090. I just don't even think about that 210. That's just going to go, and you're going to write a check in the end of the month or at the beginning of the next month for last month's trusted amounts. So let me see if are we on there. So your investment income from your perpetual care fund, it can be reinvested or it can be utilized for the care of the cemetery. It's recommended not to use, it's probably a good idea to not, it's recommended to not use your care and maintenance trust fund in the early years until you really need it, because you really want that corpus of your trust fund to grow so that you can just have a more solid future. It's like sort of like having a rainy day fund or a retirement fund or an endowment. You're endowing the future. So the longer you can wait to cash in on your retirement fund, the better your long-term retirement is going to be. So I know that for state mandated fund plans, depending on your state, you might have to take the interest out every year. Amy had mentioned that in Ohio, that's required. You have to take the interest out that was earned that year and either consciously through an action of reinvesting it back into the fund or utilizing it. So you can certainly reinvest it, but they won't let you just let it slide. You have to actually take it out and then put it back in. So in Q&A time, Amy can talk on this further if anyone has questions on that. So I'm now going to hand it over to Freddie. He's going to talk further about these trust amounts in relationship to your own financial needs.
Thank you, Laura. So yes, I want to start with the perpetual care fund, and the designated name for what I'm calling the perpetual care fund could have a different name, but the whole purpose of the fund is to make sure that there's enough funds available down the road, and I mean probably way down the road, so that you can still do what you need to do in terms of whatever kind of level of operation, some kind of specified level of operation that burial ground is going to continue to have. And you also have to meet the needs, as both Jeff and Laura have spoke of caring for the land. So in every place, once again, every facility, every organization or business that does this is going to be different. So it's not like I can tell you exactly what that is for you or for anybody really, but I can share the experience that I've had at Prairie Creek. And there are certain sort of standards that we're going through right now that whatever's needed for your individual situation, there's a template to figure it out. So once again, 10% of each burial fee is the common percentage for conservation burial grounds to place in this endowment, or what I call a perpetual care fund. The percentage could be higher. There's no reason why it couldn't be higher. Now, if you're in a state that mandates it, what I don't know, well, I'm not sure if any of Laura or Amy even knows, but I would imagine that if you wanted to put more in your mandated state fund, you could probably do that with no problem. But if not, if you're not state mandated, I'll talk to it later. You still can do it yourself. And Green Burial Council, part of their standards is that number is 10%, as well as Laura said, most states I've seen that have a mandated plan like that, it's 10%. The perpetual care fund should include calculated target funding for what you're going to need. And there's like this land, but there all needs to be a component for people that's going to be involved with that cemetery, since we're conservation burial grounds. And that could be, for many different things, but there are two obvious components that you need to plan to have the funds to continue. The perpetual, there's the people component, I wanted to speak a little further about that. It could be things like educational events or something that you've always done, like an annual memorial. You might want to have, I know Prairie Creek has planned in their sort of calculations for what will happen down the road when the cemetery is full or nearly full, is they want to have at least a part-time docent, which could be a volunteer or 2 or 3, but it also might need to be a part-time salaried person. So that's calculated in our targeting. Let's see. There's also other ways that you can tweak this fund in turn, besides the 10% or besides a higher percentage of burial fees. You can, one example that Prairie Creek did is they said anytime, and Prairie Creek's a nonprofit, by the way, but I think it could work even for a for-profit. Anytime Prairie Creek gets some revenue, usually from contributions that's over a certain amount, let's just say someone does a bequest of $50,000. Well, any bequest over $10,000, a certain percentage of that by policy goes straight to boost the perpetual care fund. And the higher that number is of the bequest or contribution, the higher the percentage gets that goes straight to there. And it really, you know, it's kind of extra at the time. The only, I guess, the only caveat to that, if someone makes a bequest that is dedicated to a particular purpose, a restricted donation, so to speak, then you can't do that because it's restricted for whatever. But sometimes people could make an entire donation just for your perpetual care fund. Then it would be restricted and all go there. I think next slide, I believe. Maybe. The conservation burial ground, if it's state mandated, then the state mandates will dictate, you know, what the percentage is, how all of that works, how it's initiated, and how it's utilized. And Laura spoke a little bit about that, and also shared what Amy had told us about how her state, Ohio, sort of makes you handle the interest from your endowment funds. But there are situations like at Prairie Creek where some states provide the opportunity for you to have a different categorized cemetery, an exempt cemetery. And in the case of Florida, anyway, that's what Prairie Creek decided to do. So it's not mandated that we have this 10% from burial fees, but as it turns out, because we're a conservation burial ground, and the whole point is to care for people in the land. So we actually started out with 15% from burial fees. Now we eventually went down to 10%, but we also, did these other things to create revenue, like I was just describing, from contributions and other things. However, the point is, just because you're not state mandated, it does not mean that you should not very carefully figure out what you're going to need as a conservation burial ground for the land and people, and have an endowment fund. So you still need to do this, whether mandated or not. There needs to be an evaluation to figure that out. And the evaluation process, as you can see on this slide, sort of speaks to that. But it should be done periodically as well. If you come to some conclusion, doesn't mean you just forget about it. At least every year or two, you want to size it up and see how it's going. You should also make sure that you get input from various people that understand, like Jeff was talking about, to make sure you're on track for what your expenses are going to be, and all of your surprises are think of calculated in there. In the case of a conservation burial, well, for startups, and sometimes just newer conservation burial grounds that are already in operation, some projections could be done as to the anticipated financial needs of that conservation burial ground. and the continued operations and land management. Once a projected goal amount is appropriate, you can, once you have that amount, dollar amount of what you think it will be, you can compare the percentage of the future burial fees. You know, you've basically got these two columns. One is if you know ballpark how many burials you can do in your conservation burial ground, you can take your percentage of those burials and see what that number is. And then you can also compare that to what some of your projections are for what you're going to need. And you can come to some consensus of what makes sense for your future. And obviously you need to have a good idea of how many burials you can do on your land to calculate that. Next slide, which should go into this a little more detailed. So in this example, $1,125,000 is that sort of what all of those burial fees when you're 90% full. I'm doing the 90% just as a conservative approach, but if you can have 5,000, a capacity of 5,000, which it doesn't really matter what the number is. 5,000 is kind of big, but reasonable to figure with. And you take 90% and say, well, we're 90% full at 4,500. And if your burial fee is $2,500 and you use 10%, that'll give you $1,125,000 by the time you're 90% full, which could be your goal. You know, that could be your goal, depending on other calculations. And by the way, I'm not figuring in here interest from investments. I'm not figuring any kind of loss from investments, and I'm not figuring in inflation. But that's okay. All that can come in a more detailed, like Jeff was talking about. You can actually do Excel spreadsheets with this stuff and have different scenarios to see some of the possibilities. But you got to come to some conclusion on your goal. And another thing I can mention here is just because, let's just say, use for example, you're at 90% and you got 10% of your plots left to utilize, but you're at 90% and it looks like you're not quite going to meet your goal, or maybe you're not anywhere near your goal. But what are you going to do? Well, you still got some things you can do. First of all, you've got a cemetery there and you have clientele and patrons, and they still care about what you're doing. So there's contributions that could be used to boost your endowment fund even at that later date. There's possibility of grants to come up for some of the things that you might have to spend some money on, so that maybe that would offset some. And you can just have events and fundraising events. So, and there's others too. So there is some flexibility here. Next slide, I think. Okay. So at some point, the conservation burial ground operations and the fund, the cash flow, you're going to have some positive cash flow. And what that is that's basically just think of it as extra cash that's over and above all your typical obligations of operating and putting money in your perpetual care fund and endowment funds. So when you see this happen, that's the time it gives you the opportunity, depending on the administrative folks and the board of directors, if it's a nonprofit. You have to carefully consider it, but for a lot of operations, they can start an investment account if that's what you want to do. And there's obviously specific guidelines based on the potential use of the money, and timelines also bring in the level of risk that you want to take with investments. The shorter timelines generally equate that you want to take less risk. Could be something as simple as a CD. Nowadays, the CD's percentage is going up. But if it's 10 years or 15 years, well, a lot of times it's worth taking some extra risk in order to get extra gains, higher fund growth. So, and the example that I want to show next slide, I think, if it's the right one. Yeah. So this is an example of actually part of what Prairie Creek Conservation's cemetery set up as their system. But you have your operating account, and then the first brokerage account, which brokerage you could do it differently, but that's when we got a brokerage account as opposed to the operating account with just a local bank. But you could do it all with a brokerage account, and you can all do it all with a bank. But we opened up a brokerage account, and we had an account that we could do investments in there. We called that our spillover account. So the way that works is there's a dollar amount that in our operating account that we know Prairie Creek knows that it can do everything it needs to do, typically, if no big surprises, with the dollar amount that is designated. Let's just say that's $20,000 in the checking account. Well, once we see funds, Prairie Creek sees funds in there that's significantly above $20,000, it automatically gets transferred electronically to the spillover account, which is an investment account. And it happens to be, a fairly conservative account, but it's always made money. It's never, in the long run, it's always made money. But it is reversible because, as it implies, it's just a spillover account. So if something comes up and it's needed back in operating, it's perfectly fine that some of it can be transferred back. And so funds can go back and forth. Now, as time goes on, and here again, it's sort of, I'm just sharing in terms of things that happen at Prairie Creek, but as time went on, we recognized that our funds in the spillover account were getting pretty high. So we set a limit on the spillover account to have a threshold of, I'm just going to say $30,000. And once things or cash in or investments get in there over $30,000, then that's when we set up another designated account called our opportunity fund. And that's a different strategy on investing because it's longer term, but it's not typically reversible. Once money goes in there, it's not as strict as the endowment fund, which happens, we've talked about that already. And the endowment fund is yet another brokerage account that's not represented here, but there's no reversing that until we're way down the road and using interest from it, which we've already gone over. So I think that's it for me. And I hope that was somewhat clear, but please ask questions at the end or type in questions. And I'll turn things back over to Jeff, please. And you might be muted, Jeff.
Sorry about that. So where do we go from here? So through this presentation, we focused on financial planning, budgeting, developing endowments necessary to fulfill your mission and your future burial operations. It's important that you develop your plan, your strategy, your values, your operational and land ethics. These will drive you and drive your process for how to take care of what you have. Develop targets and operational goals. Once you have these goals, ensure that you have, ensure that you know how you'll pay for your actions and activities. Cemeteries often have more than just the kind of the green burial attributes. They have educational programming and other kinds of outreach events. Those all do have kind of an expense and a cost, but they can also help generate sales and generate revenue. But be realistic in what you're projecting. And as I always warn, don't build anything you can't take care of. Think beyond just this in next year, 10, 20 years down the road and what you're doing. So at this point, we're going to wrap up our presentation to consider what will be explored in kind of our webinar 3. Eventually, sales will wind down as the inventory is fulfilled. How will you fund your future operations, long-term planning and financial strategies that will be necessary to secure your cemetery's long-term operations and stewardship? Now I'd like to open up the presentation for questions, and I know that Amy's been taking those questions, and we can proceed with that. So thank you, Amy.
Absolutely. Thank you, presenters. I do just want to point out that you all very adeptly kept our part of the presentation to an hour as promised. So we do have a half hour for any questions. I do want to point out, I noticed we don't have any questions in the chat room at this point, but you all maybe saw in the chat room that Susan Greer pointed out that in Ontario, the required rate for contributions to the Perpetual Care Trust is 40% versus the typical 10%. So interesting fact, but also just a good reminder to be aware of the regulations in the area where you are operating. I don't know if we don't have any questions. If people would prefer to unmute themselves, raise their hand and ask a question. Perhaps we've just done such a fabulous job of anticipating questions that there are none, but okay, so we do have a question. What is the market capture percentage you all are seeing in your area of operation? Is there anyone who is able or willing to field that question, presenters?
Oh, I wish I was astute enough to have an answer to that. I don't know. I haven't to be okay, maybe this is bad on me, but I did a great, awesome business plan, and I felt like it was solid, but I haven't gone back and done a follow-up to that, which I believe that would be what that would entail, is following up what's our percentage of the market. Not savvy enough to know the answer to that one.
Yeah.
Freddie?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know the percentage, although I oftentimes do sort of compare our local city conventional cemetery, that's probably one of the most popular cemeteries around our area. And, over 12 years or so, I've seen us be not even worth a mention to probably doing pretty close to what they do based on not very specific calculations, but enough to give me a feel for it. But I think one thing that's significant that may be true for a lot of conservation burial grounds, and that is that whereas conventional cemeteries draw, and anybody else on here, please correct me or give your perspective on this, but what my experience has been is Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery's area of fairly regular patrons is coming from a much, much bigger area radius than the other cemeteries around our area. And we all kind of know why that is. That's because there's not that many conservation burial grounds, and when people want it, they want it hard. They're willing to go. And it's kind of a catch-22 in terms of the movement. We hope that changes and that people don't have to go so far. But for the time being, it means that conservation burial grounds, it's not uncommon for them to have a very large radius. We have folks driving 4 hours, not uncommon, to bury a loved one at Prairie Creek.
So I guess a follow-up question to that, or maybe a similar question asked differently. Are you all willing to share how many funerals a year or how many burials a year you're seeing, and relative to the population in your area? And I'll just sort of, I guess, not just burials, but in terms of it's sales, I guess, pre-need sales as well. Anyone willing to take that one?
I would say for us, I couldn't answer it in relative to our population. I would have to go do the numbers, the calculations on that. But our sales, I'm trying to find I did a chart of this after one of the webinars and I promised some information for a few people that asked and followed up on that in terms of what our sales have been. Because I know that's hard to get those sales numbers for people to get a calculation of what's reasonable to expect. But our sales went, like this, and then this year they've gone like this. So I feel like this year we're in like the first 2 quarters of this year was probably double what they were the last 3 each year of the last 2 or 3 years. So we're at that, ramp up right now. So that's for us. And we're right now at 168 burials. Saturday will be our 169th. And that includes cremation and full body burials, probably about half and half. So, and we're in a, I don't know, million population region. So there's that.
Okay, great.
What about you?
Go ahead, Freddie.
No, I said, what about you?
So what year did you open, Laura? What year did you?
The end of 2016. So 2017 was our first full year of operation.
Okay. 2015 was our first full year of operation, and I would describe our experience almost exactly like yours. This year, we have definitely seen a ramp up, probably double what we had seen in prior years. And we've been, I think part of it too is, so we are connected to Kenyon College. We are also connected to the Philander Chase Conservancy, which is Kenyon College has their own land trust. The college, if you're familiar at all, it's in a rural setting in central Ohio. Part of their identity is very much the rural setting in which we exist. There's development pressure pushing up from Columbus. I'm sure you've all heard about the Intel project. We are 20 miles from that project. So the college was very interested in protecting land in our 5-mile radius around the school. So we started a land trust, and then the land trust decided, we've been dependent on one primary donor, and we needed a sustainable way to fund our land conservation. And so we decided, why not bring green burial to the central Ohio area? So that's what we did. But we are a small staff, and we're doing the work of the land trust and the green burial cemetery at the same time. So I say all of that as background to tell you that we've not done a lot of aggressive advertising or marketing of our green burial cemetery. It's been a little bit of if you build it, they will come. And now they are coming, and we are trying to figure out how we manage that uptick in activity. Part of that too is while we've not paid for a lot of advertising, we have had the local Columbus area news stations start to run stories about our conservation burial ground, and that has generated a serious uptick in activity as well. So,
Yeah.
Got some other questions in there as well.
Yeah, so the eMERGE research link that was presented, I will tell you, I have a Google alert on green burial. And so this was while we were planning this webinar, we just happened to get this very timely link to some more recent data related to green burial. You can check it out for yourself. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a trusted source or a neutral party. I think it's just information for you to take a look at and weigh for yourself if it's helpful. Another question related to working with funeral homes. Is there some form of budget needed for that?
I'll respond to that one. Not really. I mean, unless you are planning to do funeral services and be a funeral home yourself as part of your project, which is a whole nother thing. And that might make sense for you in your area, but it's a different thing as funeral homes and funeral services. What they do is totally different from, or separate, I should say, from what we do as a cemetery. So basically the funeral homes do their stuff and we do our stuff, then we create, relationships with them as part of that. But there's not really a specific, any expenses involved in that, because, we're separate entities altogether. And so I do encourage you to, try to make friends with all the funeral homes around, and don't assume that they're going to be against what you're doing. You'd be surprised at how many funeral homes, the good funeral homes want to serve their families. And if the families want green burial, they will find a way to serve them and work with you to do that. But but in terms of any budgeting on that, it's maybe like we put together a folder of information that we hand to specifically to funeral directors, funeral homes when they come, so that's just part of our print materials. That's just outreach type of thing, but it's just an extra sheet of paper that's instructions that's specific to funeral directors of, hey, here's what to expect when you have a family that wants a green burial. I hope that answers your question, Damira.
I also wanted to mention that so we're kind of right in that moment now where we're actually as we're launching, we've had this question about, okay, what is our relationship going to be with the funeral homes, and how do we prepare for that? And in particularly in a region where we are that does not really have a lot of green burial activity, but yet we have a market, within an hour of our property, there's 3.6 million people. So it's a reasonable sized market. And there's a lot of funeral homes that really do not practice green burial. So we find that there's a huge, one of maybe the budget line items is about education. The time that it's going to take for you to actually bring funeral homes to your site, to bring them on board, to to go through some of the things that Laura was just talking about they have their role, you have your role, and you have to meet, and there's a handoff, and there's a kind of a partnership that develops, and it's not necessarily a referral per se. We're working currently with 4 different funeral homes who want to work with us, and that number will grow. I'm sure it will grow significantly, and so it's kind of an evolving series of activities that we're trying to bring the funeral homes into. In fact, we have one funeral home that has decided that they want to bring a bunch of other funeral homes to our property to show it off, and to help us educate them on how they can bring green burial to their community, and here's a place that they can do it. So it's a wonderful problem to have people wanting to come to your site to do their work, because ultimately we've worked with one funeral home that really doesn't believe in green burial at all, but they had a client that was good friends with them and wanted to use their service, and chances are we might never work with that funeral home again. And it's their loss, because it's a market. It is an evolving market, and it's an increasing market. So when you look at the changes in the burial world, there are more and more cremations, but green burial is also growing as well. And so there's a whole segment of the market that's really interested in that. And if a funeral home decides not to partake, that's their choice, but it's their loss as well. And so I just wanted to point out those points about working with funeral homes, and there is a time commitment to doing that, but I think that there's positive outcome for that too.
And I would say, as long as what it goes into in terms of your budget, I would put that under, marketing outreach.
Yep.
So.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Freddie.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to that because I can, Prairie Creek started actually operating in 2010. And one of my bright ideas in 2010 was to set up this, this weekly process of doing a certain number of calls on funeral homes to explain about what we did and set appointments with them. And it was a nearly total waste of time, except for some of the wives of the funeral directors whispered in my ear, "That's what I want." But the funeral this was, someone that had an idea and had just started a new cemetery, going in and telling the funeral director, this is what we're about and we appreciate some of your business. It was a waste of time. But just to give you an idea how much it's changed, I would still say, first I should tell you what made the most difference back then. What made the most difference is doing talks with hospice, doing talks with hospitals, with groups of people, churches, because then exactly what Jeff said happened. Those people went to their funeral home. That's a whole different matter. That they're going to their selected funeral home and they're saying, "Hey, this is what I want." Well, now they've got their attention. But nowadays, like that was 2010, and we were doing a 2 or 3 burials a month and working our way through things. But what's happened now is we have a whole movement of natural burial, green burial. Now, conservation burial is a part of that, and a lot of people most people probably can't really differentiate the difference between conservation burial and just a natural burial. However, it doesn't really matter in terms of what's happening, because now funeral homes, there's all these programs, and in the literature of the funeral industry, there's all kinds of mention of green burial and even some conservation burial, and it's in all kinds of media. So it's it's happening now automatically, but it hasn't always been that way. But that's a part of this sort of revolution and movement of what's going on.
I would also like to mention, we're talking a lot about funeral homes. And again, just as with everything else we've said this evening, you have to be aware of the requirements and the license, the laws in your state. But there's also a group of folks called end-of-life doulas who can facilitate home funerals, and they can facilitate getting death certificates and burial permits. We have had the benefit of having a hospice nurse, an RN hospice nurse by training, who was living in our community just a mile down the road from our green burial cemetery. And she's been a great proponent for what we do. And we've worked with her on several home funerals and burials, direct burials from the home to our cemetery, which has been wonderful as well. Another question, I think this really goes back actually to our previous conversation about sales volumes, burial volumes, and the uptick in activity. So Diana Kern asked, I guess noticed in the gallery a lot of shaking heads when we talked about sort of a gradual buildup and then a sudden uptick in activity. Is that uptick related to just timing after opening, or emerging from COVID? Are people more engaged, looking at options, seeking alternative burial options, or something else? I will say in our experience, it was not COVID. COVID did not really have an impact on us here in rural Knox County, Central Ohio. I think for us, it was really more about people becoming aware that we exist, becoming aware that green burial is even an option. And that's had a lot to do with our education and outreach. As I said, some organic advertising, free advertising through some news media outlets that have helped us. But it's also too about, similar to what Freddie said, that's what I want. So, we've had a couple of services where we've had 100 people in attendance, and you have people coming up to you. Once they see it and they feel it and they experience it, you have people saying, "Oh my goodness, this is exactly what I want." So it's also a function of the more services you do, the more people who attend those services, the more people you have interested. Anyone
Yeah,
else?
I would
on that?
agree on that. And I don't feel, and we are in Florida, which is Florida, and we're in the Tampa Bay area. So we are not in a rural area. We're very much in the suburbs of Tampa, Clearwater, and I mean, our own county, but COVID didn't really, I mean, it could have, maybe it had an impact. You mentioned, are people more engaged in looking at options? I think there was during the early months of COVID, we did have people not coming because they had a death from COVID, but because they had time on their hands, they were stuck at home. They could do, call us and do this over the phone or email, or come in with distancing at some point with masks and do arranging, because that gave them time to start thinking about like, oh, wow, there's mortality to look at. And I've been meaning to do this. I got time to do it. It's in the air in terms of discussion about, people are dying. So I think that did provoke a good bit of an uptick in our pre-need sales. And but our sales altogether I think it was that accumulative critical mass got to that point of all of this stuff and the exponential growth. So that's something you got to be prepared for. Like Jeff said, don't expect it to happen too soon, but when it does, you kind of need to be ready to be prepared for it, because this year, I should say, I actually started thinking, gosh, can we handle, do I even want to put on another spot on the NPR station or the community radio station? Because I want to make sure that we've got the time to handle, an uptick of more calls than where we are now. So.
Yeah, I mean, Prairie Creek's advertising budget has gone from, in the early years where we spent a fair amount of money, still not a whole lot, but a fair amount of money going to things like NPR, specifically with the idea of getting the word out and generating some folks to come to the cemetery, to now the only advertising Prairie Creek does is for the most part, to support local groups that it's almost like thank you advertising, like the Pride community, who are a huge community for our cemetery, or the Sierra Club, or we do advertising as a thank you. And I mean, it's still advertising, but it just like Laura said, it's like we just are so, or I shouldn't say we, I'm not an employee anymore, but Prairie Creek is so busy all the time that it's enough. And we've gone from having a part-time employee to having 4 full-time employees. And I mean, that's been like 12 years, but and it's exactly as Amy, for us, it was exactly as Amy and Laura said, is it just each year got more and more until finally it took a huge jump up. And then 2020 COVID came, which only served to make it another jump up. So it's really both at Prairie Creek was noticeable. The fact that this exponential growth and the word got out, as well as COVID boosted it even further. And the other thing that I'll just add is one of the most important things that we learned is whatever you can do, website, whatever a new conservation burial ground can do to make sure that people are first approaching you instead of a funeral home. Have nothing against funeral homes. It's just that we know what conservation burial is and all the details and things that make a difference for people. If we've had instances where we found out later that someone had gone to a seminar from us or whatever, they are responding to an article, they go to a funeral home, and the funeral home really did not convey what needed to be conveyed for the people to fully understand conservation burial. And it didn't happen. But if they come that's the opportunity to make sure people understand what they really want to know about conservation burial. And, I have no problem with funeral homes. And I think as you work more and more, as we and Jeff is talking about, they work with some particular funeral homes, they actually do get where they can do a better job, but I don't think they ever do as good a job as we do. So that's all.
And I think there's got to be a lot to, it's really important that you're controlling the message that's out there as best as you can, because there's
Right.
certain ways that you can't control the message out, in social media, and people, stating their opinions and what they think is what your story is. But, just from it's just important to be able to do your best to control the message. So if you can get your families to learn about you through your website, instead of the funeral director that's maybe lukewarm about you still, and going, I think it's, blah, 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 the kind of way. And if that's what you want, we'll do it. But, they're not necessarily going to be, saying it, most likely are not going to say it in the same way. So.
And it is, I think it is important to note too, that, we have recently developed a relationship with a funeral home who they, I think, are going to be one of our biggest advocates. They are definitely generating business for us. The funeral director who owns the funeral home wants to be buried at Kokosing Nature Preserve. And so that's when you can find that kind of a relationship with a funeral home. That is ideal.
Yeah, that's golden.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, and we made it through the questions in the chat room. So just wanted to thank everyone again for attending our webinar this evening. Thank you to our presenters for sharing your knowledge and your experiences. We appreciate it very much. Hope you will attend our next webinar on November 16th, same time, 5 o'clock Eastern time. We will be discussing investments for growing. And again, a reminder that you can access copies of the recordings of our webinars for free for CBA members and paid attendees. Take a week, again, as I said, but before we can distribute the recordings. But thank you for your patience on that. The link to view them will be sent out to your email directly from the Conservation Burial Alliance. So have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
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 All right.
Good job, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy,
Yeah.
for stepping in and taking that. You were great. That was really
Oh, thank you.
cool.
I was
So,
glad to help. Glad it worked out. I was glad I was able to do it.
good. Yep, that was good. So,
All right.
have a
Thanks,
good
Laura. You have a
evening.
good evening.
thanks. Good night, everybody.
Wait a minute, this is Heidi.
Wait,
Hi,
oh, hey,
Heidi.
Heidi.
I just have to tell you guys, that was awesome. I think that whole exchange at the end about your own experiences was so valuable to people. And I love that you're speaking directly to the importance of the role that
Uh-oh, Heidi, you're getting out of range.
Yeah, we're losing you, Heidi.
Whoa.
have to play. We can't do everything,
Mhm.
and we're all choosing based on our. Yep. Just congratulations.
Okay.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank
We
you,
appreciate it.
Heidi. Take care.
Take care. Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Bye.
You're awesome.
Bye. You are too. Bye.
Bye.